Okay, so thanks for the reminder to record. And today's panel is part of a larger effort that San Francisco State is rolling out a new climate change certificate. We anticipate that it's going to launch in fall of 2021, and it's going to be a series of 4 courses about climate change. There'll be a foundational course, a course relevant to causes, impacts, and solutions. And what I want to emphasize that this is really a collaboration between every college on campus, not just science and engineering, but also health and social services, liberal and creative arts, business, education, ethnic studies, and the College of Extended Learning, which is super important because we want both students and community members to have access to this certificate. It's designed specifically to help foster leadership around issues surrounding climate change. So before we launch into the panels, I want to do a brief introduction of our panelists for today. We're super lucky to have these folks on board. The response rate to my queries was amazing, and we just have such a wide diversity of expertises that we're so lucky. And so Bill Tripp is a Karuk Tribe Department of Natural Resources specialist. Bill learned to use fire in a cultural way, starting when he was about 4 years old. For the past 27 years, his career has progressed by connecting water, fish, wildlife, plant, and human resources to fire processes and function, while building relationships and protecting cultural resources on fire events. Gretchen LeBuhn is a professor of biology at San Francisco State University. She's the director of the Great Sunflower Project, which is the largest community science project on pollinators in the world. Veronica Lerman is a sophomore in environmental engineering at Humboldt State. She just finished her first year as a forestry technician, and here she's shown right after being in action. Maria Estrada has been supporting the North America Fire Initiative at the Nature Conservancy for the past 4 years. Her work has involved building strong relationships of trust and reciprocity with both workforce and partners to collectively strengthen the case for equity and inclusion in our Living with Fire work. John Balmes is a pulmonologist at UCSF and a physician member of the California Air Resource Board. His research is focused on the respiratory, cardiovascular, and metabolic health effects of various air pollutants, including smoke from wildfires. Don Hankins, who's joining us by phone, is a professor of geography and planning at Chico State. Don draws from his academic and cultural knowledge and is particularly interested in indigenous traditional knowledge and policy and their application as a keystone process to aid in conservation and stewardship. Lynn Schofield is a biologist for the Institute of Bird Populations. Her current research focuses on understanding how wildlife responds to forest fires in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. And last but not least, José de la Torre, professor of biology at San Francisco State University. His research focuses on microbial ecology and evolution with an emphasis on the nitrogen cycle. So briefly, our plan for today is that we're going to have one short panel session with 5-minute talks. We'll have some time for question and answer. Then we'll go into a second panel session, also with some time for question and answer. The question and answers sessions can be directed at any of the panelists. So I'd like to ask if you have some chatting to do it in the chat window if you want to make comments and that sort of thing. But as the panelists are presenting, you're welcome to start putting questions in the Q&A box for later. So with that, I'd like to welcome our first panelist, and that will be Bill Tripp.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to speak here today. Cultural burning is deeply rooted in indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief systems of the Karuk people. An intricate patchwork of fire use was maintained in a 2-mile radius around our villages historically. We've lived here in permanent wooden houses for millennia. An interconnected system of burning across the entire landscape helped to keep lighting fires confined to well-established fire sheds, reducing the duration and persistence of smoke per event. Fire is a critical part of our annual world renewal ceremonies. Near Orleans, in a place called Tashonik, Our world renewal priest does a belly flop on a specific day in the lunar cycle. This creates ripples that travel down the river, carrying a prayer, calling the salmon up. The belly flop makes a loud sound, and this represents the thunder that follows lightning. At the same time, we were supposed to light a fire on the top of Black Mountain to the north of Orleans. Being an annual occurrence, this needs a northeast wind to even burn, but it blows the fire away from the permanent houses. The fuel needed for it to run for miles in a matter of hours is simply not there. The smoke settles in the river canyon into the night. The river is shaded by the smoke throughout the day. The temperature in the water becomes cooler. The particulates from the smoke clog tiny holes in the leaves and needles that the trees use to breathe. This modifies the way trees use water. They pull it up at night and redistribute it at the surface for use during the day. But because the smoke, they don't need to use as much of the water. They have more efficient access to the carbon they sequester. The small trees and brush that use surface water are burned. Then again, less water is used. This water makes its way into the stream and the flow rates fluctuate differently, creating a pulse that ripples down the river to the ocean. This combined with the lower water temperatures are the cue the salmon are waiting for to enter the river. We've evolved together over thousands of years to react to these cues. This was taken from us as indigenous peoples. We were murdered for doing it. So I would hope that people can understand why we can get so upset to see what's happening today. Climate change is a significant stressor. Management of our forest is a significant stressor. Fire exclusion is a significant stressor. But the combination of these things exacerbate the negative consequences of fire and perpetuate a response founded in fear. The removal of indigenous people from our natural role of balancing fire process and function is a root cause that led to the impacts we all face today. And with that, I will end that little story.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Gretchen, LeBuhn is up next. You'll need to unmute.
Yeah, let me share my screen.
Mhm.
Laura, you have to stop sharing for me to be able to share.
There you go.
Well, thank you, Bill. It was so interesting to hear just about the relationship between people and the land. It always gives me a new insight to think about how long North America's had these relationships with people. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that happened in my lab on climate, fire, and pollinators. And I want to give a shout out to my graduate student, Molly Hayes, who's now working for the Xerxes Society, and a collaborator of mine, Diego Vasquez in Argentina, who really got us thinking about sort of how to think about the sort of the networks between plants and insects in the context of fire. So I'm sure that it's not unfamiliar to anybody here that there are two main effects of climate change that we see in the natural environment. The more typical one is the one here on your right, the shifts in precipitation and temperature. But many people don't really think about that there are going to be changes in disturbance regimes, though more recently, because of the impact on fires in our dense population centers, we're really getting a lot of attention. My lab's been working a lot in oak woodland habitat around California. You can see this is typical oak woodland from Napa on the left here, and the distribution of the different oak woodland forests you can see on the right. And you can see that it's a major habitat in California, and it's one that's critically affected by climate change. And the main thing that we're seeing these days is actually fire. And so in 2017 was the first large fire in the Bay Area. Over 220,000 acres were burned. This was the first one that had significant smoke coming into the Bay Area. And the size of the fire was really expansive. On the left here, you can see the extent of what ended up being called the North Bay fires, but it was really the Kincaid, Atlas, Nuns, and Tubbs. Well, for my lab, this set up an unusual situation because we had previously surveyed a number of sites around Napa and Sonoma. So if you look at this map on the right, I'm just going to orient you. Here's the city of Napa. So this is the Napa Valley going up this center. Over here, this is where Boys Hot Springs is. We're heading up towards the Sound of Sonoma, but this is Sonoma Valley over here on the left. So we had gone out and surveyed 8 sites distributed across the Napa and Sonoma Valley. And the fire happened to burn 4 sites and leave 4 of those sites unburned. And as a scientist, this sets up the strongest type of experiment that you can do, what we call a before-after control impact design. And what that means is that you have a set of sites that were all the same beforehand. For us, we had surveyed these in 2002 and 2003. And you're able to look at the effect of the impact, in our case, fire, by comparing differences, how much change there was between before and after between the impacts and the control. So my lab works on pollinators. For this particular study, we went out and surveyed bees, and we did this by using nets and collecting bees and writing down all of the plants that we found. If you think about bees, there are a couple different potential responses. We know that often there's a pulse of floral resources. This picture here is of a brodia that only emerges after fire. And we know from individual species, these are data on bumblebees in the Sierra, that sometimes we see increases in the number of colonies or of individual species after a fire. And we think this is actually related to the potential increase in floral resources. So what we were looking for was changes in the number of species at these sites, changes in just the abundance of bees at these sites, and then changes in the types of species at these sites, and whether or not those plant pollinator interactions were important. For saving time, I'm going to start by saying, in these sites, we did not find a change in the pulse of floral resources, nor did we find a change in the number of species or the abundance of individuals, which suggests to me that there is a level of resilience in these communities in response to fire that may reflect the fire history of oak woodlands. We do think that they were burned with some regularity, and all the sites were in medium burn areas. But what surprised us was this. This is a diagram that maps onto sort of 2 planes the composition of the community. And if you look at this, the blue and the green circles, you can see that they're overlapping. And what this says is that the sites that we sampled earlier, if we map them into a space to say how many individuals and how many species were found in these sites, were pretty similar. They have a lot of overlap. But after burning, we saw a difference between the 2 sites. So the red is the control, I should have done it as the burned, and the black are the areas that were burned. And what this says is that the communities spread apart. They started to have different species in them after a burn. We also saw differences in how bees visited plants. And let me just walk you through sort of one of these diagrams. On the top here, each of these bars represents a different bee species. The width of the bar tells you how many times we found that bee. The bottom bars here are the different plant species, and the width of the bar represents how many times we found a bee visiting that plant. And so what I want you to draw your attention to is that if you compare this earlier network to this lower network here, you can see there are a lot more skinny lines. You can also see, this is actually the unusual one, only one of our 3 sites did we see an increase in the number of plants that were getting visited. So what we found is that there were fewer plants providing resources after a burn, and we found that there were more bees that used all of these plants. So there was an increase in bees that were generalists, and we lost the specialist species.
1 minute, Gretchen.
That's all right, I'm almost done here.
Perfect.
So what we were able to detect, because we had this historical data, was an effect of fire on pollinators. We saw that the communities changed, and we saw that the traits, whether they were generalist or specialist bees, determined which species were able to survive. But I think there was also good news in this, which is that we didn't see the expected changes in abundance or species richness. So at least some of these communities may be resilient to fire, even in the face of other factors that are influencing, bee communities are known to be declining overall right now. So there is, I think the long-term message is that fire can be a disaster, but it also can be a reset to historical conditions that can have benefits for the wild community that's there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. Getting some interesting questions coming in so far, so we'll look forward to getting back to those. Next up is Veronica Lerman.
I'm gonna share my screen. Second. Okay, here we go. Oh man, how do I get the present button?
There
Sorry.
it is. You're close.
Okay, so first off, I just want to acknowledge that in some ways I'm a little bit underqualified to be talking about this. I only have 1 year in fire and I'm a student, so it's not, I don't have like a professional academic opinion, and anything that I say is not representative of any national or any federal fire agencies or, who I worked for or anything like that. So I think that context talking about fire suppression, as many of the other speakers have said, it's important to acknowledge that it's not the fire itself that's bad, it's having fire in places that we don't want fire that causes us problems. And so even though I'm going to talk about suppression because that's what I'm used to and that's, my experience, I just think that it is important to acknowledge, the role of fire in the ecosystem. Okay, so this is not a complete list, but when I think about who fights wildfires, at least in California, I think that just from a starting standpoint on suppression, there's the 5 main federal agencies: the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Department of Indian Affairs, and then you have state agencies. So for us, that's CAL FIRE. And then there's also contract crews, which are crews that are contracted to fight fire. So as far as resources go, again, this is just a partial list, but these are the main resources that I think about in terms of suppression for wildfires. There's a lot of different resources. There's heli-tac, which are firefighters that arrive in a helicopter, and there's hand crews. Each resource has their own strengths and weaknesses. Like a lot of the aerial or aircraft resources, heli-tac, smoke jumpers, and repellers are really good as far as initial attack goes because they can arrive to a fire very quickly. There's also engine crews, which bring water with them. There's aircraft. There's overhead, which manage larger incidents. And yeah, that's that's just a visual representation of that. Okay, in terms of suppression, from a on-the-ground standpoint, these are the most common tools that we use to suppress fires. The three up here, Very Pistol, Drip Torch, and Fusees, are used to put fire on the ground and widen a line that's already been created. That's usually how they're used. Hand tools are used, line, mop up, a lot of things. Retardant and foam. Foam comes out of the engine instead of water, like it's an additive, and the benefits to retardant and foam is just that the moisture is retained longer than if it were just water. And chainsaws, obviously, kind of fun, very useful. Okay, just another visual representation. This is not, this is not representative of every firefighter. This is not representative of every agency, but this is the standard line gear and PPE. I might have forgot something that's used in the US. And here we're supposed to have gear that sustains you for 36 hours, I believe, which is the longest that a shift is supposed to be. So that's why you have quite a lot of stuff. So just in terms of some basic techniques and terminology, this is a photo that's just kind of the anatomy of a wildfire, and it shows the way that fire spreads from the point of origin out towards the head. And in terms of most suppression strategies, they always talk about anchor and flank. So you start digging line, or you start the process of trying to stop flames, usually at the point of origin and where the fire is backing, instead of by the head, because the fire activity will be a lot greater in the direction that the wind's pushing. And these are just three of the main, I don't know if techniques is the right word, but techniques that firefighters use in terms of suppression. So control line, that's usually the first step. Sometimes it's a natural boundary, sometimes it's created, a lot of ways it's created, and then burning it off so that you can remove the fuels in the area between the line and the fire. It like widens the line. And then once the fire is gone, or the main flames are gone, there's mop up, because smaller flames and heat need to be taken care of because it could reignite fire.
1 minute.
Perfect. So hazard, risks, and factors. These are, again, not a complete list, but this is what comes to mind. The majority of the hazards and risks that are associated with wildland firefighting. And then snags and hazard trees. Those are trees that are damaged or weakened, and that's a big one. Heat illness, another big one. It's hot, you're out on fire. Vehicles and transportation. I'm pretty sure that's actually the leading cause of firefighter death. So like anyone else, driving is a really dangerous part of a job. Hazmat, chainsaw injury, aircraft, when there's helicopters, it can be dangerous. And then these factors down here are factors that lead to extreme fire behavior, which increases risk of burnover or risks of injury associated with extreme fire activity. And then the human factors, I think, this is the way that we can change our risk and mitigate the risk, and it's how we impact the level of risk presented by a hazard. It can be positively, it can be negatively. Yeah, and that's it.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. So let's see, I gotta find my slides again. Next up, we have Maria Estrada from the Nature Conservancy.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that the team that I work for at the Nature Conservancy is the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team. So I want to lead with a few assumptions that I make in my work. One is that all the work we do is in deeply inequitable spaces. Those spaces are inequitable today, given a historic system of discrimination and racism that persists today. And yet the people who live with the failures of these systems today have critical information to resolve, the planetary problems that we face within the environmental movement. Indigenous peoples is one example. Let me share my slides. I want to tell you a quick story about one partnership within the work that I do at the Nature Conservancy. Is between my team, the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team, the North America Fire Initiative within the Nature Conservancy, and the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. And this group is one of the early adopters of the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Nature Conservancy. And one of the things they've been interested in since the beginning of the work our team is doing was equitable engagement within communities where we haven't traditionally partnered or done work in partnership. Just want to let you read the slide. And really what I'm trying to do with this slide is ask you to imagine being trapped in the path of a fire without knowing the language, so not having access to potentially life-saving information. This is the reality of working with the devastating events of climate change in communities where there is deep inequity. We know through research that the catastrophic disasters that we see are hitting the communities that we've marginalized, that we've made vulnerable first and hardest. And we also know that in order to be able to live with fire, in order to be able to bring to a community to a place of preparedness and resilience, the people working within those communities need to include everybody. Resilience requires the entire community. So the leaders in this work need to understand that part of their work is weaving networks and building relationships of trust and confidence and reciprocity, where they are letting every group in the community know that they are seen, that they're valued, that they're respected, and that their perspectives, their needs, the ways in which they're being impacted need to be at the table when decisions are being made. So in this partnership between the Nature Conservancy, the Fire Adapted Communities Network, and more specifically the Washington Fire Adapted Communities Network, we did in North Central Washington, where we learned during the fires of 2014 and 2015 that some of those communities who did not have equitable access to life-saving information were left behind. So the work that this team has done is first identify Latin serving communities, community-based organizations on the ground, and then build coalition with those communities, particularly to identify trusted messengers and leaders within the community who understand the community and can take this life-saving information into those communities in ways that are both respectful and responsive to the needs of that particular community. So in this case, in the work in Washington, those organizations, all the partners, went to work in building a curriculum for leadership in this space And they developed a number of leaders on the ground who now have the capacity to take the information that will be needed in the event of a catastrophe to those communities that in one way or another are isolated and need this kind of relationships, this kind of networks that they can tap in this sort of situations. So really quickly, I just want to share with you some of the takeaways from that partnership and similar ones that we are testing in other places at the Conservancy. And one is that inclusion is really critical in this work, and it's about encouraging diverse perspectives. And it is really important that the ways in which a community understands itself and vis-a-vis, the issues at hand need to be leveraged in service of creating a more complete picture of the challenges that we all are trying to resolve. Another important learning from this partnership and others in my work is that relationships come first and before any task. And trust and reciprocity is critical for work that is sustainable, because the people who remain on the ground have to believe in the work if they are the ones who are going to be the stewards of the work we do on the ground and adopt practices that are sustainable and that are supportive of the work that we do. Another big learning is that there are always power dynamics. One of them I named with the inequity that's created through discrimination and racism. And so leaders need to be aware of these dynamics, need to understand how dominance and power show up in this kind of relationships with communities. And they need to lead from a place of awareness so that power can be shared. We're, in this reciprocal relationships, we are not only taking critical and life-saving information to communities, but we are learning big lessons also. Again, this idea from systems thinking that the people living with the failures of the system, given their resourcefulness, they know a lot and they can teach us a lot about the work that we are doing. And finally, one skill that we need to have in this work at the Conservancy, but I encourage all of you to think about the work you do. We need to hone a particular skill, and that is having conversations, robust conversations, sometimes where dissent is present in productive ways, in ways that are generative. And we see today that that's a skill that is lacking in many organizations, and we need to put an effort to train people to be aware of, in situations of, conflict or dissent or, uncomfortable conversations, taking a deep breath, acknowledging that you are having a hard time, that you're feeling reactive, that you're feeling triggered is an important skill. Perhaps voicing, that feeling in the moment, and making a commitment in the moment that you'll lean in order to understand what the other person is trying to tell you, to see if there is something that can emerge that is different from, the disagreement. Perhaps a third space where something new can be created in our partnerships.
1 minute, Maria.
I look forward to the questions.
Very good. Thank you so much. Fantastic. We're getting some great questions rolling in. So our last speaker for this first panel will be Amanda Stasiewiecz, and she's from San Jose State.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and also share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to build off a little bit of that and talk to you broadly about some of the work being done in kind of the social science arena around differential adaptation to fire in the WUI, or the wildland urban interface. So what we know, what we've seen in California, a lot of our newspaper headlines have been around wildfire being a people problem. Right? So is it a design problem? Is it a emergency management problem? Is it a forestry and forest management problem? And a lot of what our leaders, even up in the Forest Service, have acknowledged is that we need to figure out how to better manage people and prepare people for wildfire events. That's a huge component of what we're doing, especially in the spaces that we're targeting with a lot of our state and federal policies, which is the wildland urban interface. What we've seen is a number of exclusions through different laws and policies come up for doing field management in those spaces, right? So we've kind of, as a society, identified those spaces as places that we need to better adapt to fire. For those of you who are not familiar with the wildland urban interface concept, it's the area where residential development intermixes with or is adjacent to wildland vegetation. So this, a lot of people use in a more geography context, a certain residential density as an indicator of the WUI. But there are people we know in very rural settings that do deal with fire risk as well, even if they don't have this certain number of people living in a certain number of acres. So our policies need to reflect that as well from a social justice kind of standpoint. So we have this main strategy for dealing with wildfire risk. So like when we talk about the fire problem, a lot of us want to know how can we fix the fire problem? What is part of that? And we have from the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy outlines the three kind of prongs of the fire problem in the US. One of that is what some of us have touched on already, the restoring and maintaining landscapes. So dealing with the hundreds of years of fire exclusion on our landscapes has promoted certain forest conditions that are unhealthy, where we're seeing that fires are moving across those landscapes rather than being low severity where that is appropriate. They end up being more intense, higher severity fire events that induce tree mortality. And we're also seeing them become larger, right? So we have more acres burning in the US right now than we have historically, but with fewer fires. One of the interesting caveats right now is about 4% of California is burning or has burned, and that's much actually closer to our pre-colonial average. That's the number of acres that we would be expecting to actually burn in California annually, just under different conditions. Another prong is promoting fire-adapted communities. This is the idea of almost biomimicry. That's saying if humans are going to occupy these landscapes, they should be fire-adapted like the vegetation. They should be able to live with fire. And then the last prong is an effective and safe wildland fire response. This is focusing on suppression and evacuation. And when we're talking about this, it's important to think about all of these kind of hit a different scale, right? So when we're talking about restoring landscapes, we're thinking big regions. When we're talking about fire adapted communities, we're talking about pockets. Community is a hard thing to define, right? We're talking about pockets of people that are going to come together and collectively address wildfire risk. What some people have done is start using this thing called fire sheds as a concept, which scale is kind of similar to watersheds, saying that we should be managing fire at a scale that it's actually going to go across a landscape, which starts bringing in multiple players, right? You're going to have private landowners, you're going to have Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, state actors, as well as tribal communities, and that you need to incorporate to address fire on these landscapes. So what my area of research does, and with some other kind of natural resource sociologists have been working on, is that all communities living in fire-prone areas are not the same, and you probably don't need to be told this. But obviously the communities that live in gated communities or ski towns are going to have very different skills, abilities, weaknesses, and strengths for dealing with fire risk as compared to more rural or remote communities or working landscapes where there's ranching and logging. And we need to create policy tools for addressing wildfire risk in all these different scenarios and contexts, right? You can't say that the same tools are going to work in your highly residential areas are going to have the same ability to transfer to your more rural landscapes. So that needs to be done at a state and federal level, kind of create that room for different kinds of communities to adapt across landscapes. So I wanted to go over a quick case study here in more of a rangeland context where it's going to have, I think, has major applications for the way we're seeing things here. Thank you. So in the Great Basin Desert, we see a lot of high fire intervals. And what's happening here is that it's a mix of climate change, of wildfire return intervals changing, and cheatgrass, which is an invasive annual grass. This is impacting sage grouse conservation as well as ranching. And basically what happened here was there's a lot of conflict between ranchers and fire management professionals around suppression on landscapes and access. That was, of course, in Idaho, and some of the more remote areas included things like armed resistance. One of the programs that came out of this in this large wildfire risk area was something called Rangeland Fire Protection Associations. What happened here is basically everybody came to this tipping point where ranchers were actually given their Wildland Firefighter Type 2 certifications, turned into an NGO, and able to go out and assist in suppression efforts in rural areas. What this helps us do is address gaps in our ability to suppress, deals with things like we just saw high activity fire years where we have too few boots on the ground to be able to address all fires in a quick fashion. And it also helped with sage grouse conservation efforts by keeping those fires smaller. So this is an example of a way I think we can all move forward, is working through private and agency partnerships during suppression and prevention efforts around fire. That's where I'm going to stop.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we have a little bit of time for some Q&A, and then we'll come back to our second set of panelists, but I wanted to give people a time to kind of express some of their questions and not have to listen for too long. And so there's some great questions in here. And so I'm just going to kind of sift through them and see how far we can get in a few minutes. The first one is for Veronica. Can you talk about prescription burning in the agencies, state parks, for example, that use crews to set prescription fires for resource management purposes?
Honestly, I do not know a lot about prescribed burning. I've never been on a prescribed burn crew. I'm not on a burn module. I think it's really important for resource management, as you said, but yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about it. A lot of different agencies are involved. I think state parks,
well, here,
right?
I'll give you a second question then.
That's it.
As a student with your limited experience, have you been able to actually be on the front lines of firefighting, and have you been able to receive firsthand experience?
Yeah, I mean, when you're a student and you're a firefighter, like, well, it's a forestry technician, we'll call it. When you're a forestry tech, it's the same as anyone else who's also a forestry tech. Your season just ends a month earlier. Like, I mean, personally, I worked for the Bureau of Land Management, and I don't know. The first image on the thing was my image. I thought it was pretty. That was the hog fire, but yeah, you do go on the front lines, whatever that means. But yeah, you're at fires.
Thank you.
Laura?
Yes.
This is John Balmes.
Yes. Hi, John.
At the hospital, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I could make a comment about prescribed burns if you'd like.
Sure.
So I've been involved with some study of wildland firefighter exposures during prescribed burns, but I think the best thing to illustrate about the importance of prescribed burns, the rim fire that started in Yosemite a few years back, mostly spread through the Stanislaus National Forest as opposed to Yosemite. Why? The National Park Service could afford to do prescribed burdens in forest management. Whereas the U.S. Forest Service managing the Stanislaus National Forest was unable to do prescribed burns or any other type of forest management. And that just shows you how important prescribed burns can be for forest management.
Okay, thank you. And I know Amanda's got a little bit more to add there, but I want to make sure that we kind of spread some of the questions around a bit. So Bill, one question is, how can those of us at San Francisco State and beyond help support the efforts of tribes to be heard at the state and federal level of fire management?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest issues about tribes being able to be heard or even recognized is that our education systems have been basically designed around indigenous peoples being a component of history, and don't place us in the context of anyone that even really exists in contemporary society. And so, you know, it's only been recent years when you know, local Native American history is been required to be taught in California schools, and that kind of thing. And so, you know, making sure that you know, the question comes up, that, hey, are we talking to people indigenous of this place? As you move into your careers, I mean, you're university level people now, and you'll be moving into a job market, and you know, maybe become those managers of the future, and so to make sure that you're building those relationships and having those conversations is important. I've been having these conversations for the past 27 years in my professional capacity with agencies and institutions, and even when we're just got done talking about the fact that we're going to be working together with federal, tribal, state, and NGO partners, you know, 2 minutes later, people are saying, yeah, feds, states, and NGOs are going to do this, and the same people that just said something different minutes ago. And so it's just, you know, I don't know if it's just deeply ingrained, you know, systemic racism that's involved, or if it's just not in the forefront of people's minds. Either way about it, you know, it's just important to make sure people are involved in the conversation.
Yeah, that sense of inclusion is really ringing true in so many places, or the need for inclusion, I should say. Maria, there was a question about, it keeps popping around here, but basically it was the recognizing the value of your work about inclusion in this process, and how you plan to assess whether what you're doing is working or not.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. But I think that with the example of the partnership that we tested in North Central Washington, I think one way to measure success is the replicability of the model. You know, I know it is difficult to move something that worked in one context to a new context, but you know, that is one way. And then, you know, the other thing I want to say is that relationships and trust and reciprocity are very difficult to measure. Those are things we don't, you know, we don't value. So, you know, we don't know how to measure them.
Yeah, thank you. And Gretchen, I know this question probably got answered offline, but I think a lot of people have it. Why bees? What's so special about bees? Why are you tracking bees?
So we're interested in bees because they're indicative of the rest of the community. There's a lot of biodiversity in bees. There are over 4,000 species in the United States and 1,500 species here in California. Probably in that area I was working, there are 400 species that are within that group. But they also provide what we call an ecosystem service, which is that they do pollination. So by studying bees, we get a metric that tells us something about what's happening to the ecosystem services, along with something about what's happening to biodiversity. And so that's been why that's been the focus in my lab.
Thank you. And bees, of course, are the pollinators for all the plants we need for life. Super critical. Let's see. Amanda, there was a question about how to apply what they've learned in Idaho to California. Can that be done, and what would it look like?
Yes, so I think that there is space in California and more rural areas to apply the RFPA program, but citizen agency partnerships don't need to just be in suppression, right? So to make some ties to some of the folks' questions about prescribed fire, something that is starting up in California but was kind of born in Florida and moved its way across the West is prescribed burn associations are becoming more common, which is a way to introduce prescribed fire across public and private lands and still cover some of the liability of an escape to burn and things like that. So these are kind of ways moving forward to start managing. What we need for a lot of wildfire mitigation for vegetation is landscape level change. But the social units, our little social groups are so much smaller than that. So we need to scale that up through partnerships.
Fantastic, thank you. And so here's a question for any panelist. How can a minority student feel more included in something important like wildfires and other environmental impacts, and how can they involve others in their communities? So just raise your hand if you want to tackle that one. Anybody?
Would you just repeat it, Laura? Say it
How
again.
can a minority student or a student from an underrepresented background feel more included in something important like wildfires and other environmental impacts? And how can they involve others in their communities? So how can you get involved? Veronica.
Well, you could always work as a firefighter in the summer if you're a student. And then I think something that's really important, especially in minority communities, is just, I don't know, go out and enjoy nature. I think that sadly there is a disparity between who benefits from the natural resources we have from a recreation perspective. And so I think that, like, whether it's starting a club that's about hiking or just going out and having a good time camping, I think that it's really important that everybody should have the wilderness accessible to them.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Lynn?
Yeah, I would say find ways to connect with people in your community that are doing this work. You know, one of the organizations in Washington is the Latino Community Fund. So any organizations that serve your community that might help you tap into networks where you can, you know, get to know people, you know, learn from them, build relationships. It's a good way to start.
And Lynn, you had something to pipe in with?
I guess I have a few small things that I might be able to contribute. And one of which is right now living in the East Bay, I haven't been able to get out and hike and that sort of thing. And I recognize that that's true of a lot of people, that having this immediate access to, you know, the national parks or something is a bit of a privilege. But I found a few things that have helped me connect a little bit with nature right in my backyard lately. One of which is iNaturalist has this lovely app where you're submitting data for them of observations of natural history, but the app helps you identify things, and really any plant, any insect, anything you can get a picture of on your phone, it will help you identify. And that's kind of opened up a lot for me, being sort of stuck in the East Bay right now, to appreciate just even the garden plants and bugs that have been there. And then another one, this is sort of a shameless plug, but the Institute for Bird Populations, one of our goals is to encourage people who are early career aspiring wildlife biologists. And we every year have positions for people that require essentially no previous experience. The requirement is primarily that you're interested in wildlife and interested in getting out. And we cover housing, we have some pay, and it's a great opportunity. But that's a shameless plug on my side. But
Perfect. Well, that reminds me to give a shameless plug too, which is that, you know, faculty at San Francisco State, Humboldt State, Chico State, San Jose State, they have research laboratories, and they invite students, including specifically, especially students from underrepresented backgrounds, into their laboratories to get engaged in this type of research. So just reach out to faculty and say, hey, what are you working on? Is it cool? Can I work on it too? And we will welcome you into the fold. So I have there's a whole bunch of questions here, and panelists can kind of answer some of them offline, I think, but there's one which is a perfect segue, I think, into our next speaker, which is, what are the health impacts of wildfire smoke? And so if I recall who's first up in the second session, it is John Balmes, who comes to us from UCSF. Thank you, John.
And so I can share my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, so first off, it's a pleasure to be invited to participate in this webinar. As I told Laura, my wife is a a member of the history faculty at San Francisco State. So it's fun to be cross-pollinating from UCSF to San Francisco State. So a few years back, with colleagues, including my doctoral student, Colleen Reed, we did a critical review of all the health literature with regard to community exposures to wildfire smoke. And this photo doesn't come from the article, but this was during the Thomas fire in December 2017. It was a big fire in Southern California. And, they're all wearing N95s, which is a good mask to protect one from wildfire smoke inhalation, but it's not actually approved for kids, for example. And should they be out at all when the air quality was really bad? So that critical review that we did really was all the literature through early 2015. And there was clearly evidence of an association between wildfire smoke and respiratory health. Really no surprise to all of you who've just experienced the bad air quality we've had here in the Bay Area. I know some are from elsewhere. And there's no question that people with asthma have increased risk for exacerbations. Same is true for people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is usually caused by cigarette smoking. But you can have exacerbations from exposure to wildfire smoke. And then important for us now in the middle of a COVID pandemic, there was growing evidence, and there's more since we published this, of a link between wildfire smoke and respiratory infections. Not specifically for COVID-19, but for other bacterial and viral infections. And since we published that study, that review of the literature, there's been increased evidence of cardiovascular effects. That wasn't so clear when we published, but this is a paper that came out of Australia, not from the recent horrible fires that they had last fire season in Australia, but actually from the 2006-2007 fire year, which was not nearly as bad. And they showed increased risk of out-of-hospital cardiac arrests for men and increased hospitalizations for heart attacks for women. And then this is of special interest to those of you who live in Northern California. This was a study by a UCSF medical student, first authored in collaboration with the California Department of Public Health and US EPA, using data from the 2015 fire season, before the bad fire seasons the last few years. And they found, and they also were able to separate wildfire smoke, fine particulate PM2.5 from other sources, diesel trucks, power plant emissions, et cetera. And they showed the expected increase in respiratory healthcare utilization, but they also showed cardiovascular outcomes. And there was a exposure response in all age groups, except for younger people. So there are other health outcomes that we're concerned about based on what we know from fine particulate PM2.5 from other sources aside from wildfire smoke. Adverse birth outcomes, including low birth weight, preterm birth. There's actually some evidence from California fires, one of the San Diego fires from like around 2007, that pregnant women who are exposed to wildfire smoke may deliver low birth weight kids. And we know that tobacco smoke does that, so it's no real surprise. Mental health is, of course, an issue, both because of bad air quality and then the stress of people who have to evacuate. And then what we really don't know, and what I get asked about all the time, are chronic effects from recurrent exposures. This bad air quality we've had in Northern California for the last couple of months, that's a precursor of what's going to happen over the next few years. It's what is called the new normal. And so we're concerned, based on what we know from other types of PM2.5 air pollution, about metabolic outcomes, effects on diabetes, and thanks, Chair. Sorry, I'm at the hospital, so people are asking me questions here. Older folks like me, have when exposure to PM2.5 has been associated with cognitive decline. And at the other end of the life course, kids' neurodevelopment has been shown to be impacted negatively by PM2.5. We know about decreased lung function with chronic exposure of kids to PM2.5 and concern about the health of pregnant mothers. My last, I have 2 more slides. So we heard about wildland firefighters. Thank you, Veronica. I've been studying wildland firefighters for, 30 years. And I've been involved showing that across a fire shift, those long fire shifts that Veronica was talking about, where there's much heavier exposure than communities get, there was decreased lung function and evidence of inflammation in the lungs. We've also shown across the whole fire season that there are these changes, but what we don't know, because firefighters are off during the non-fire season, whether these changes persist. So we need to study wildland firefighters. I thought I had, we need to study wildland firefighters, career firefighters that come back every year, not just the students that do it for a couple of years, to see if they have increased risk for damaged lungs, increased risk of lung cancer, increased risk of heart disease. And my final slide is about COVID-19 and wildfires. This is the worst wildfire season in California history in the middle of a pandemic. Prescribed burns. The US Forest Service decided not to do prescribed burns this year because they were worried about the impact of the smoke on risk of COVID-19 and risk of recovery of people who had COVID-19. Can evacuations be done safely in the midst of a pandemic? That was a big challenge. And can we even fight wildland fires the same way we normally do? Fire camps for mega fires are the norm, and that social distancing not very easily done. The U.S. Forest Service tried to avoid big fire camps this year. And Cal Fire uses prisoners for a lot of the grunt work that U.S. Forest Service firefighters do themselves. And a bunch of firefighters got sick in training. About a half of a crew being trained at the Lassen Fire Camp got sick. So, and how do we protect the public? Hopefully people followed the shelter in place and masking for COVID-19, which should reduce exposure to wildfire smoke. But we expect when we come out of this fire season to show that there was some increase in COVID-19 related to wildfire smoke exposure. And that's what I have.
All right. Thank you so much, John. Our next panelist is Don Hankins, and like many of our students, he has unreliable internet access. So I am going to share his slides in a pre-recorded thing, but he is here on the phone and will be available for questions. So let me see if I can get this going. Let me make it slideshow. I want to play from the start.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present on this panel. Today I'll be talking about the use of indigenous traditional knowledge to aid in conservation and stewardship, and in particular, how to do that with fire. Nearly every indigenous group in fire-prone regions globally have a story about the first fire and how they learned to use fire in the time after that. And I think about those first fires, and what that means is that it's basically telling of a story where large, devastating fires burned over the landscape. And I think that's really the situation that we're living in today, and looking at the fires that we've been experiencing within our state, across the region, and even globally. So we need to learn how to live with fire, and that's something that's really part of the traditional knowledge that I'll be sharing today. If we think about those stories, they tell us a lot about the world around us. They tell us about the different species that are part of our landscapes, and ultimately how we have responsibilities to steward for those species. And fire is a tool that we have used to do that for many thousands of years. And a lot of the species that are mentioned in our traditional stories happen to be rare species today. And we still have an obligation to steward for them. And so we need to be putting fire back in the landscape. And that includes some of the species that I have shown on this slide: the California tiger salamander, the California condor, the Alameda whipsnake, and the spring rim Chinook salmon. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the specifics of my research and how I use indigenous fire and that approach to indigenous fire to steward for native ecosystems. And in particular, I'll highlight examples from my own research of how we're able to achieve that. And specifically in this slide, what I'm showing is the use of fire based on a cultural lens of thinking about how and where to apply fire within the landscape to steward for restoration of native species cover. And I've been able to do this in a variety of different ecosystems, including wet meadows, blue oak woodlands, valley oak woodlands, black oak woodlands, and grasslands in general. And one of the trends that I see is that when we don't put fire into the landscape, our native species tend to be fairly difficult to find within that landscape in terms of their cover. And when we start to apply fire at the right times, we can eradicate non-native species from the landscape and enhance the ability for our native species to be present. And so what I'm showing is real data from a blue oak woodland where we've applied fire to it. And if we look at the time period following the fire, by 1 year following the fire, we've got almost a twofold increase in native species cover. And 2 years following fire, we've gotten to almost a fourfold increase in the total percent of native cover within that system. That's a pretty amazing change. And if we keep with it, we're able to steward for those species across the landscape. There's a difference between indigenous cultural practices of burning versus prescribed burning. And I think that's a really important thing to highlight, is that the way that through a cultural lens, we can think about how to read the landscape, understanding the dynamics of species and how fire affects each one of those species within the landscape is a really important part of it. What I'm highlighting here is a case study from a prescribed burn that was set in the Sierra Nevada mixed conifer forest in 2018. And specifically in February of 2018, where in the time period of when this fire was set, there were already indicators that suggested that culturally it wasn't an appropriate time to burn. Specifically thinking about emergence of our native grasses and forbs, thinking about beginning nesting of some of the migratory birds. These would have been indicators to tell us not to burn at this particular point in time. And then when we do apply fire to it, what are the outcomes that come from it? In the lower portion of this map, what you notice is that there's a grayed shaded area. And that was burned a little bit later in the spring, happened to be in April of 2018. And in this case, that area burned at a low intensity, but because the foliage in the pines had begun to transpire, there was a lot of moisture that then sweated out of the trees, transpired out of the trees, and that loss of moisture so rapidly top-killed 11 acres of conifers in this forest. Not a desirable outcome from what was set as an objective of this burn. Timing of burning is really important, and in this particular forest, what I'm showing here is the dynamics of species and how certain native species, like our bromes, didn't do too well with that February burn. Whereas other species that emerged a little bit later seem to have done just fine with that. Example here would be Poa secunda, which did really well following the fire. And so these dynamics are really important to understand, is how every single individual species will shift as a relationship to the type of fire that we're putting into it. So by reading the landscape, then we can think about how to benefit native species and how to steward for native species richness and habitat heterogeneity within the system. And here I'm giving an example from the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, where we did a burn this past spring, also in February, but based on the conditions of this particular year in this very place, the native species hadn't emerged from germination yet, and we were able to run fire over it and eradicate non-native species, particularly annual grasses, and then by a couple weeks later, those native species began to emerge, and really was an amazing sight to see this particular spring out at the Big Chico Creek Reserve. And here is an example of how we can apply fire based on that knowledge system to what I'll say are more complex systems. And this is a mixed chaparral ecosystem where we are putting fire back in falling 20 years after a wildfire. And so with high fuel moisture in the spring, we were able to put fire back into the system to reset the heterogeneity within the system to create a fine grain mosaic, or start to restore that fine grain mosaic, which will help to support biodiversity down the road. So the scaling of indigenous fire tends to be at a finer grain scale than wildfires. And I think that's a really important take-home message from what I'm looking at to share today. And that if we think about where and when and how to put fire back on the landscape, if we're looking at it through the indigenous lens, we're basically looking at something that's, maybe upwards of a few thousand acres versus the millions of acres that we're currently experiencing. And on both the ecological side and the social side, there's a lot at risk that we need to be aware of. With that up, that if there's questions, I'll look forward to the discussion in the panel. Thank you.
All right. Let's see here. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you, Don. Even though it wasn't live, he's here live. And our next speaker, our next to last one, is Lynn Schofield from the Institute of Bird Population.
Well, all right, let me get the screen share going. And of course, this is a huge and nuanced topic that I'll get some insight from in 5 minutes. So I'm going to do a quick case study that will help illustrate some broader concepts, because I feel like there's a lot of, and Don actually sort of addresses it a little bit, because I feel like there's a lot of back and forth. So are wildfires good? Are wildfires bad? Natural system? So what's going on? So wildfires have always been part of the landscape. Pre-settlement, the fire return interval, so the amount of years between fires naturally in California, is anywhere from 6 to 30 years, depending on the region you're in. And the thing is, fire is a part of ecosystems worldwide. So there's me by the classic fire danger, Smokey the Bear sign. But to the right, I used to work in parts of Mexico, and that sign says roughly the same thing. Fire risk is high. So that's Yucatan. It's part of ecosystems everywhere. And so the thing is, even birds that you think of as being old growth forest species, they are resilient because they've evolved alongside fire. So here's a gray owl and a spotted owl, both happily perched on burned logs in territories that they continue to maintain within the fire area that their territories were in. But the thing is, not all fires are created equal. So on the left, we have a fire, the Mesa fire, and you can see that there's a lot of live trees, and there's a lot of areas where there appears to be no live trees at all in little pockets. And so that's a complex ecosystem with lots of different resources available. To the right, we have the King fire, on the other hand, where nearly 50 miles in a straight line burned functionally all of the trees, the crown. There's no canopy cover left. There are no live trees left. It got rid of a lot of the seed stock. So these fires are not the same. And part of what's driving that is climate change, changing wildfire dynamics. Fires are bigger, more intense, and more frequent, and climate change is one of the important drivers of that. And so this graph I found is out of date, but the top 20 largest California wildfires ever, we have a lot of them happening just this year. The August complex, over 100 or over 1 million acres. So what are the consequences of the change in a fire adapted ecosystem? So my case study is the blackback woodpecker, which is a fire specialist. It wants to settle in and live in areas that burn. And that's because burn trees are the perfect place to build a nest. And burn trees are the perfect place to find their favorite foods, which is wood-boring beetles that are specifically attracted to smoke and lay their eggs in the dead and recently burned trees. So we're having more and bigger fires than ever. It's bad news for humans, but is it at least good news for the woodpeckers who love the fire? So we went to the rim and king fires to find out. These at the time were the biggest intense fires in the Sierra Nevada history. And so here's a quick back of the envelope calculation. A woodpecker needs about 225 acres for a territory to successfully raise young, find food, and live their lives. Rim and king fire between them burned over 350,000 acres. So in theory, you should be finding 1,500 woodpecker territories. And what we found after an exhaustive search across the entirety of these fires was 19 total pairs of woodpeckers. Why so few? This should be their habitat, burned trees. So to figure out the answer to this question, we went to some fires that do have lots of black-backed woodpeckers. And we tracked 41 adults and 27 fledglings after they left the nest to see what they liked in the fire. What about these fires was good for them? And so what we found is that the adult woodpeckers, these maps here, the yellow is places that burn nearly 100%, the green is areas that burn very little. The adults did exactly what we expected. They stayed in the dead trees. That was perfect habitat for them. But the fledglings didn't. They spent their time in green live trees. And that's because adults want to be looking for food in the burned trees. Whereas young birds, their entire mission for the first couple months of their life is to survive and let their parents feed them, because they're not good at flying yet. They're not good at taking care of themselves yet. And it's safer in the live trees. Without the live trees, the young are at an extremely high risk of being predated. So the takeaway is pyrodiversity is key. And pyrodiversity means an area that has a mix of high and low severity fire, that has an ecosystem where some live trees remain, other areas get burned severely. And that is what provides you with habitat good for these woodpeckers. So that fire on top, full of woodpeckers, it was just the right sort of place. Whereas that fire on the bottom, that's the king fire with that huge red area of high severity burn, there were very few woodpeckers there because there was places for adults, nowhere for their babies to live. But it's not just about these woodpecker fire specialists. Pyrodiversity means biodiversity. And so these woodpeckers just in a single species needed high severity and low severity burn, but then you have between species. The Mexican free-tailed bat, they like areas that are recently burned and open. They have big long wings that is good for the open areas. And their echolocation calls are low frequency and long because that's what you need to navigate through open areas. On the other hand, the little fringe myotis, it needs denser trees. So what you need is areas with burn and areas with less burn and areas in the middle. And so that means fires are good because that creates these open areas and great for the free-tailed bats, but you can't have a fire that is nothing but high severity because then you'd have nothing but the free-tailed bats. And this is true across taxa. It is true for fire-adapted insects, mammals, plants, that you need a diversity of fire to have a diversity of species. So is a new fire regime good for a fire-adapted ecosystem and for fire-adapted species? And the answer is no. There needs to be fire, but the system needs to be in a certain balance. Yeah, so hopefully I got across a big topic in 5 minutes there.
You did great. Thank you so much. Very interesting. So our last speaker before we head back into Q&A, I'm getting some echoes, so if somebody can mute maybe, then is José de la Torre. He's a microbial ecologist and evolutionary biologist who specializes in nitrogen cycling.
All right, thank you, Laura. Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'll share my screen. And so I will start off by saying that that although I work on microbial ecology, I do not work on fire. And so what I really wanted to do was describe some of the effects that fire has on the microbiology of soil as well, but also talk a little bit more about sort of the implications beyond the fire in terms of climate change. And so I'll keep these very general, and we can have more detailed discussions in the Q&A. And so the gist of what I wanted to get across was really that the fires may be horrible and may have a tremendous short-term acute impact, but these fires also have extremely long-term impacts in terms of both the landscape they're in. We saw some of those burn scars that last 20 years, 30 years or more, but also they can have a lasting impact on the climate as well. And we've seen pictures like this one. This is from NASA from this summer, where we see these plumes of smoke covering California and the entire West. And when we look at where those particulates are ending up, they're being distributed globally, and the impacts are global, as you'd expect. There's actually evidence now that microbes can travel on those smoke particles and be disseminated across the globe through these fire events. But what I wanted to talk about is in terms of when you have a fire, what happens to the soil? And we know that the heat penetrates into those soils very quickly, and that heat is retained by the soils for a very long time, days after the fire event has ended. And the consequence often is a complete sterilization of those soils. And so, for example, here's a table that I found that talks about if you look at the soil temperature, what are the main consequences? And at these low temperatures here, you have water loss, plant death, seed death, as we were hearing a little bit earlier, and then also microorganisms death, so bacteria, fungi, and also archaea. All the microorganisms living within that top layer of soil disappear. And we know that those microorganisms are extraordinarily important, not just for the soil, but for all the larger animals and plants that live there as well. They are key parts of that ecosystem. At higher temperatures, you get volatilization of the compounds in that soil. The carbon, you have huge plumes of CO2 that arise because the carbon is being volatilized, is being oxidized. But you also have nitrogen and phosphorus compounds that are disappearing. And so you're at very high temperatures, you're actually decreasing the richness of that soil. That organic matter ends up charred and oftentimes not usable by biological organisms coming afterwards. As I said, microbes are a key part of that type of environment. They're a important resource, often symbiotically with the plants, that allows them to extend their root networks that are key for plants to establish themselves. And in recovery of fires and burns, those bacteria, archaea, and fungi play an essential role in plants being able to reestablish themselves. Those microbes also play a key role in recycling nutrients, carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus especially, within the soil system. And if those soils are sterilized, that geochemistry is no longer happening. And here you have an example of what not including the microorganisms in the soil does to growth of some plants. Here's another example of an apple tree and the root systems that are established when the soil is treated with bacteria and fungi that promote growth, as opposed to sterile soil. And you can see that the plant is much more successful in establishing a complex network of roots if those microorganisms are present. The absence of those microorganisms prevents many of the plants from reestablishing themselves after severe burns. Now, the low intensity burns that were naturally part of the ecosystem, like we've heard, often do not penetrate deeply into the soil and don't sterilize it. And in fact, are an important part of seed germination and reestablishment of native plants, as we heard. But in these intense burns that we're seeing now, the consequences extend almost a meter down into the soil. And they really are very, very detrimental to the sort of ecosystem, the microbial ecosystem that most of us can't see. In terms of and so these are the important things that happen locally. But one of the things that we sort of focus on in the news is these fires that affect us on a day-to-day basis here. Globally, though, the biggest fires that affect climate are in the boreal regions, in the Arctic. And those fires are enormous compared to the ones that we've faced in California. So for example, in Siberia today, in this current year, calendar year, already something like 47 million acres have burned. So an enormous amount, an area about the size of Greece. And in Alaska, similarly large fires are burning as well. And the problem with those fires is that they're in extremely remote areas with very low population density. And so there isn't the capacity to go into those to either do prescribed burns or to do the types of management that we've been hearing about. And so these fires are really widespread. And if you look at, so this is an image from the 2012 fire season, these fires are spread out throughout this entire Arctic region here in Russia. And they have huge global consequences. One of the most severe consequences is that they thaw the ground. And this area is completely covered in permafrost. And permafrost, for those that aren't aware, is areas of the soil that are essentially frozen. So you usually have a thawed layer on top in which the vegetation is establishing itself. And then these frozen areas of soil underneath can go for tens of meters down, if not more. And trapped in this is an enormous amount of organic material. This organic material is frozen and inactive, but as soon as it starts to thaw, unfortunately, microbes start turning all of that organic material primarily into methane. And so as the permafrost in these Arctic regions thaws, this methane escapes the ground, and methane is 30 times worse in terms of its greenhouse effect compared to carbon dioxide. So these massive fires are thawing the ground in the Arctic. Those thawed ground, the ground can remain thawed for over 30 years. And as a consequence, you have huge emanation of methane, which further exacerbates the climate changes that we're seeing in terms of global warming. And so you can see that you get within the burn region, you get increased thawing, you get bogs forming, and this changes the dynamic of these ecosystems in a way that really affects sort of the global carbon cycle severely. And when you think about the size of the permafrost, so here's a map that shows all these areas shaded in varying depths of blue indicate the permafrost and how deep it extends. It's really an enormous amount of the Arctic. And as the climate changes further and as these wildfires burn, more and more of this permafrost is going to thaw, further exacerbating the changes that we're seeing. And so I'll stop there. And if we want to talk specifically about methane cycling and things like that, we can do that. But I think we want to save enough time here for people to be able to ask questions.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. There's just so much to learn about wildfires. And so I have to acknowledge that John Balmes had to jump off the call because he was called away for doctorly duties. So very happy that he was able to join us for a little bit, but he won't be here to answer questions. And so Don Hankins, if you're still here, I think you are, can you comment a little bit more about the difference between a prescribed fire and a cultural fire? Or Bill Tripp can pipe in too. Is Don still here? Don't see him. You might have.
Sorry, I had it on mute.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Sure thing.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's a big difference that I can see between prescribed burning and cultural burning, and I'll start with cultural burning to kind of outline it. So if we think about living in the landscape and the way that we as indigenous peoples have connected with the landscape, there's a lot of different reasons why fire would be applied to the landscape. And part of that's linked to our traditional laws, like I talked about in my presentation. But then there's a lot of different other parameters that we want to think about. For instance, we could be thinking specifically about birds or weather indicators or plant phenology. Those sorts of things are all cues that help us to define when and how, where, and what we're going to be setting on fire. Whereas on the prescribed burn side of it, a lot of times that kind of knowledge is not necessarily applied into that system. So while sometimes you can have a prescribed burn that does include what I'll call cultural parameters, a lot of times the objectives are very different, where it's focused maybe on hazard fuel reduction or wildlife habitat improvement as the primary objectives, where on the cultural side, it's often much more integrative in terms of the types of knowledge that's being used and the outcomes that's going to come from that. And so those are some of the things that help to distinguish it. And if you're interested, I can provide a link to a paper that talks a little bit more about it that Christine Erickson and I had done back in 2014. But there's a lot more that's out there around it too that kind of helps to define that. And I'll leave it to Bill if Bill wants to add anything further to it.
Thank you, Don. Bill, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I like to draw a reference to the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy when it comes to this, and the primary goals of to live with fire as part of that, and so I see prescribed fire, at least as it's put in place right now, as it's being used a lot as a training opportunity, and the types of things that Don mentioned, fuels reduction primarily. But a lot of times, it's regimented and it's planned, it's prescribed, it's got to have the fire line that's 2 feet wide every time, regardless of anything. You have to have this, you have to have that, no matter what your situation. Whereas cultural, and so that's a system that is done by people that aren't maybe not even living in that place. People that are coming in to do a job. Whereas cultural burning, from the indigenous perspective, I agree 100% with everything Don said. But ultimately, looking into a contemporary future, it really needs to become about a way of life, and actually living with fire in place, and to put it, learn how to live with that fire and how to put it back into its place and to restore that human-fire relationship with that environment. We really have to make this a cultural norm, or we're just going to continue to see what we see today.
Yeah. So Bill, I think, everybody we've heard from today is in great agreement with that. What do you think the stumbling blocks are to getting kind of cultural burning back as being part of the norm?
Well, fire is very much stuck in a command and control presence, owned by some agencies. And, we work very hard to break down those barriers, and try to get there. But, I don't think there is a one solid straight answer for that question. But it's something that we're taking baby steps towards addressing. and getting a little further every year. But then all it really takes is for one person in an agency to turn over, and all the relationships are changed, and you're starting. You just lost 5 years,
Yes.
and we don't have the time for that.
Yeah, and Maria, of course, talked about the critical nature of those relationships and trust that takes time to build. Thank you, Bill. Lynn, so Glenn Fieldman asked, are you probably familiar with the heartbreaking story of birds falling from the sky dead in Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona? The estimate was that hundreds of thousands of birds died. And she had heard there was some speculation that the migration season coincided with lots of smoke and fire. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so I know a little bit about this, and I want to preface with an understanding of exactly what any individual bird or animal does during a fire is very difficult. It pretty much has to be an accidental experiment, because you'd have to already be tracking that bird, and the fire would have to happen by accident to know exactly what's going on. But at a broader level, there's a few things about bird migration and fire that would create a real hazard for the birds. And one of them, of course, is that just bird physiology in general, they have incredibly efficient respiratory systems. It's different than a mammalian respiratory system. It's one way, and they absorb a huge percentage of the oxygen that they take in. Whereas humans, mammals, when they breathe, it's only a small amount that gets absorbed for each breath. So that means that smoke inhalation is something that birds are more sensitive to and have a greater chance of succumbing to. The other thing is during migration, their metabolism is cranked up to 11, and they're really sensitive to things during migration. Most dangerous time of the year for birds by about, they're like 20 times more likely to die during migration than just about any other time. And then, of course, during bird migration, they rely on having places to stop en route to refuel to get going. And if that place that they usually would stop en route is on fire or has too much smoke, that puts them at risk of not having the place to refuel. So yes, fire poses a huge risk to migratory birds. Exactly what that risk is to any given individual is really hard to understand. There's not enough studies on this. I'm actually currently working on a proposal that uses data from the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory of raptor migration in the last 35 years and smoke data taken from satellites to see if we can start to untangle that a little more. If their behaviors change, if their numbers change during these times when smoke is playing a significant role in atmospheric conditions. So that's my attempt at a very difficult question.
Yeah. And Bill adds in the chat box that Karuk law says that we're to stop burning when the birds come back to nest. We can't start again until the Pleiades, that's a constellation I think, shows itself again in mid-June. And so they've got their own traditional ways of knowing through a variety of metrics. Jose, I have a question for you.
And maybe that's the people who actually know this more than the scientists do, because it is such a hard experiment to do, and those observations are what we need to start with.
Yeah. And so, Jose, my question for you, you show this graph with the different temperatures and what happens to the microbes. What kind of temperatures were achieved in the Bay Area fires? Do you know? How hot did they get?
I don't know how hot they get. Most of these come from experimental systems where people place fuel on top of experimental soil, but the temperature can reach in these things that model these large firestones up into these thousands of degrees centigrade. It's really incredibly hot, and that heat persists for a very long time.
And so I have a question for any panelist who wants to answer it. But we're coming up on election season, and I can't be political because we're using state money here. But my question to each of you is, if there was one policy that would be relevant to wildfires that you could change, what would it be?
I feel like this is a difficult question, and why we're all hedging is because one policy is really hard. You know, the causes and problems of wildfires is many and varied. I'd say climate change is the most pressing. And the thing is, combating climate change is a lot of policies that need to be enacted, and things like the Green New Deal, I feel very positively about. That is a first step that needs to happen. And of course, changes in management are also something that we need. But I think something that people are not, you know, when they criticize, oh, the forest management is part of the problem. And surely it is, but one of the things is it's not forest management now entirely, it's a legacy. 100 years ago, almost all of California was logged. And that means that we have an entire state worth of trees that are the same age, the same size, and it's the age where they become vulnerable to fire. And so sure, management changes need to happen, but this isn't something that you can do overnight. Changing, you know, issues with the climate isn't something you can change overnight. So one policy is hard to identify, but
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that one policy would do the job. It was a suggestion of what would be the one that you hold nearest and dearest. And if we put hundreds of policies together, maybe we would get somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think the Green New Deal is the best effort people have to tie a lot of that together. So that's what I'll put forth.
Okay. Amanda, how about you at the wildland urban interface? What policies there would be helpful?
Yeah, it's interesting in this space because especially given the kind of continuum I showed up, right? Saying a policy or a law is only going to really work in certain communities that have are kind of open to that, where that's palatable, right? So it's kind of hard to identify in the WUI. But something I think that we can all kind of agree on is private property ownership of their fire risk. And because what we found in some of our studies of people who plan to evacuate during a fire are actually less likely to do a lot of the risk averting activities that make it safer for firefighters to come in. And some of the fires we've seen this season, it's been very nice on Twitter to see the note saying, you know, my home is not worth your life. And that's just a thing that we need to keep thinking about, is that you can do a lot to make the space safer for firefighters in the WUI while also protecting your home.
Thank you. Anybody else? Maria, from an equity and inclusion point of view, what kind of policy could make things better?
Well, I don't know about a policy. What came to mind when you asked that question, I wanted to lift up the work of Robin Wall-Kimmerer and how she talks about valuing indigenous knowledge, you know, in the same way we value Western science, because it can bring a lot of balance and a different set of values, spiritual values to the work that we do. So I feel like it's more of a mental model, right? That right now we desperately need that wisdom of millennia that Lynn was talking about, millennia of observation and experimentation. So that's, you know, what I would love to see organizations like mine lifting up, you know, indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of thinking and doing to par with Western science.
Okay. Any other panelists want to speak to policy? I guess as the person kind of moderating this, I want to say that I feel like individual actions are important, but the changes are going to happen with policy and with education, and those two come together. And that's why I'm trying to kind of push on this point.
So there's one that I've been talking about recently that I think has some great potential to gain some traction around what everyone's saying here. And so, you know, one of the things that we've done here at the Department of Natural Resources is we've established this Karuk UC Berkeley collaborative, and that has since grown out to many academic institutions and individual researchers and many partners in establishing a foundation for experiential learning and blending indigenous and Western sciences in doing so as a holistic workforce development program. And so, it just so happens that right now the UC system is looking at the effects that the land grab from the land grant use universities have had on indigenous peoples through dispossession and distribution of wealth away from indigenous communities, and essentially making some homeless in doing so. And so there's a great opportunity right now that would only take a short strike of the pen with the California State Legislature to take a look at the Moral Act and create an authority for the UC endowment, which is like $13.4 billion, to be able to donate up to 1% of its revenue in years that it generates more than 6% to stand up these Indigenous Field Institute workforce development and training programs. That endowment only supports the UC system at significantly less than 5% of its need right now as it is. And so I think that has the potential to go a long ways to really stand up these programs throughout the state, if not the nation, if other states sign on as well.
Thank you. And Veronica.
I just wanted to agree with what Bill said, and also I think that I don't know if this is very policy related, but from a workforce standpoint, I think that a lot more should be invested in terms of getting Indigenous people, women, people of color involved in fighting fire. It's an incredibly white, straight, male dominated space. And I think that, like, in the context of talking about how do we grow this workforce with climate change and the increased need of having wildland fire, like the increased amount of firefighters that we're going to need, I think that we've just completely neglected quite a big chunk of the population by the way that we define firefighter usually. And I think that one of the reasons it's so inaccessible is because it's a very poorly paid job. And one thing I've noticed is that most people who are wildland firefighters, it's a privileged job to have, because you usually have to be coming from a family where you don't have to pay everything yourself. We get paid minimum wage as a GS3. So like for me, I have a lot of my college paid for by my parents. I wouldn't be able to have that as a job, and go to college if I wasn't privileged and I didn't have that perspective. And so I think that policy in terms of raising the wage, starting salary for wildland firefighters, and also just in terms of trying to get more women and people of color and Indigenous people involved is a great way of expanding our knowledge and our workforce.
Yes, and I think in addition to being more inclusive, that raise in wages, they've been showing more and more the health impacts on firefighters. And so if you're going to be at risk, then you need to be compensated for that. Thank you for that, Veronica. So we're at 2:55. Is there one last comment? I heard somebody.
I was just going to comment on the law part of it, and this is Don, and I think that for me, when I think about that question, our traditional laws, our Indigenous laws, tell us about how to live with fire, and that way of living with fire was something that was helping us to adapt to climate change that happened in the past and continues to the present and into the future. And I think that if we were to go back to that way and get rid of the laws that currently impede that, then we as a global society can move forward in a different way. And so those are kind of my thoughts around that idea.
Thank you so much. And so I just want to say a couple of words in kind of parting here. And first of all, thank you so much to the panelists who came today. I know that you all had incredibly busy schedules, and many of you have been asked to be on many panels, and yet when I emailed you out of the blue, you said yes. And for that, I'm tremendously grateful. And I think we just had such a lovely spectrum of kind of expertises and knowledge and insights that it was really fantastic. So many thanks. People have been asking in the Q&A, whether this recording will be posted. It will be posted on our biology department website. We also have the emails of all registrants, so we will send out a link to the recording to all registrants, and we'll probably send you out a survey too, just to see how this went and what could be improved. And if you could help us out by answering that, that would be super helpful for us. Lastly, I just, hope that this is it's not the start, but I think that there's some energy now around climate change. San Francisco State has some energy around it with the emerging climate change certificate. And I hope that everybody can commit to doing one thing, whether you're a climate change expert or not. I am not, but I organized a webinar. What can you do? Everybody needs to commit to doing one thing so that we can step up as a society to really try to mitigate the effects of climate change. And lastly, wouldn't be a webinar without a pitch for money. We're just getting our climate change certificate started. If you'd like to donate funds to help support this cause, we'd welcome them. You can email me at lburris@sfsu.edu. Would also welcome other types of donations. And we will be having more webinars in the future. So we'll be reaching out. We hope that you can come and learn more about different aspects that are affected by climate change and how we might work to remedy them. So thank you, everybody. And we're going to send you on your way on time. I hope you have a lovely Friday and a lovely weekend, and stay safe and be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This was great. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. It's been just a huge pleasure.
Thank you, Bill. I really like your perspective. That was really, really interesting.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all.
Bill, I asked you in the chat, one of my former students at San Francisco State is a woman named Erin